January 4th, 1986. Phil Lynott lies dying in Salisbury Hospital, his body ravaged by years of heroin addiction, septicemia spreading through his veins like poison through Dublin's River Liffey. The man who put Ireland on the rock map, who transformed being an outsider into art, who made poetry dangerous and rebellion beautiful, is about to take his final bow at 36 years old. Outside, snow falls on England like ash from a crematorium, while inside, the black rose of Ireland withers in a sterile room far from the Dublin streets that shaped him. The boy who learned to sing his way into acceptance is now beyond the reach of any melody, any harmony, any rhythm that might save him. Phil Lynott, poet, rocker, Celtic warrior, eternal outsider, is discovering that some battles cannot be won with guitar riffs and clever lyrics. But who was this man whose death would leave Ireland mourning its greatest rock star? How does a mixed-race child in 1950s Dublin transform rejection into rebellion? Racism into rock anthems, pain into poetry that still echoes through the streets of every city where music matters. The stage was the only place Phil Lynott ever felt whole, but off it he remained broken pieces, searching for something. Love, acceptance, peace. That heroin promised but never delivered. The needle always found him, as he wrote in his final journal entries, chasing shadows that led not to enlightenment, but to this hospital bed where Ireland's black rose is about to wilt forever. To understand how Phil Lynott became both Ireland's greatest rock export and its most tragic loss, we must travel back to a Dublin where being different meant being dangerous, where survival required learning to fight with words and melodies instead of fists. This is the story of an outsider who became an icon, a poet who became a rocker, a man who put Ireland on the rock map, but could never find his own place in the world. The cowboy was always lonesome on the trail, but the trail led not to redemption, but to the slow death of dreams and the fast life that killed the dreamer. August 20th, 1949. In Dublin's Rotunda Hospital, a child is born who will grow up to embody everything Ireland fears and everything it secretly desires. Philip Paris Lynott enters a world that has no category for what he represents. The son of Philomena Lynott, a young Irish woman, and Cecil Paris, a Guyanese man whose dark skin makes him invisible in a country that prides itself on being homogeneously white and Catholic. The Dublin of Phil's birth is a city still recovering from centuries of British occupation, still defining itself in opposition to everything foreign, everything different. To be mixed race in 1950s Ireland is to exist in a space that doesn't officially exist, to be neither fish nor fowl in a society that demands clear categories and simple answers to complex questions. Philomena, faced with the impossible challenge of raising a mixed-race child in a culture that views such children as evidence of moral failure, makes the heartbreaking decision to leave Phil with her mother Sarah in Crumlin. This abandonment, motivated by survival rather than cruelty, becomes the first defining trauma of Phil's life, teaching him that love often requires distance, that protection sometimes looks like rejection. Sarah Lynott, Phil's grandmother, becomes the closest thing to unconditional love he will ever know. A strong woman hardened by poverty and loss, she recognizes something special in her mixed-race grandson and determines to give him the armor he'll need to survive in a world that will never fully accept him. She teaches him that being different isn't a disadvantage. It's a superpower waiting to be discovered. The Dublin streets of Phil's childhood are narrow, cobblestoned, and filled with children who learn early to identify outsiders and eliminate them through words that cut deeper than any knife. Phil's skin marks him immediately as different, but his quick wit and natural charisma begin transforming liability into asset. He discovers that making people laugh is almost as good as making them accept you, and that sometimes being memorable is more valuable than being liked. School becomes Phil's first stage, the place where he learns to perform his way out of trouble and into grudging respect. His teachers notice something unusual. This mixed-race boy from Crumlin possesses an almost supernatural command of language, an ability to manipulate words like a magician manipulates cards. When other children taunt him about his appearance, Phil responds with verbal combinations so clever and cutting that his tormentors often walk away feeling like they've been defeated by someone who fights with weapons they don't understand. Music enters Phil's life like salvation disguised as rebellion. The radio brings sounds from America, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, performers who prove that outsiders can become kings if they're willing to sing loud enough and fight hard enough for their right to be heard. Phil recognizes something in these voices, the sound of people who refuse to accept the limitations others placed on them. His first guitar arrives like a weapon designed specifically for his hands. Sarah, recognizing that her grandson needs something more than words to fight his battles, scrapes together enough money to buy him an acoustic guitar from a Dublin pawn shop. The instrument becomes Phil's confessor, his best friend, his means of transforming pain into something beautiful enough that others might willingly listen to his truth. By his teens, Phil has discovered that music amplifies everything he already knows about survival. Timing matters more than technique. Confidence trumps perfection, and the right combination of vulnerability and swagger can transform a room full of strangers into believers. He begins writing songs that sound like poetry set to rhythm, lyrics that capture the beauty and brutality of growing up different in a place that demands conformity. The formation of his first band represents Phil's declaration of independence from a world that never quite knew what to do with him. If Dublin won't accept Philip Lynott, the mixed-race outsider, maybe it will embrace Phil Lynott, the rock star. The stage becomes his homeland, the only place where being different transforms from liability into asset, where his darkness becomes mystique rather than problem. But even as Phil discovers his power to command audiences and transform rooms full of skeptics into fans, the fundamental questions that will haunt his entire life are already taking shape. Can an outsider ever truly belong anywhere? Can someone who learned to perform love ever experience the real thing? And what happens when the applause stops and you're left alone with the person you've spent your entire life trying to escape? Dublin's music scene explodes with the energy of a generation discovering that rebellion can be beautiful, that tradition can be revolutionary when filtered through Marshall amplifiers and Hammond organs. Phil Lynott, now 19 and armed with bass guitar, poetry, and the kind of presence that makes people stop mid-conversation when he enters a room, is about to transform from promising outsider into Ireland's most unlikely rock star. The formation of Thin Lizzy begins with a meeting that feels like destiny disguised as coincidence. Phil encounters Eric Bell, a guitarist whose Northern Ireland Protestant background makes him almost as much an outsider in Dublin as Phil's mixed-race heritage. Together with drummer Brian Downey, they create something unprecedented, an Irish rock band that sounds like it belongs on international stages rather than local pubs. But Thin Lizzy is more than just another rock band. It's Phil's vehicle for rewriting the narrative of what it means to be Irish. Where traditional Irish music speaks of sorrow and exile, Phil's songs pulse with aggression and possibility. Where Irish poetry has always been concerned with looking backward, Phil's lyrics face forward, toward futures that don't yet exist but might be created through sheer force of will and electric guitars. The early Thin Lizzy albums reveal Phil's genius for synthesizing seemingly incompatible elements. Celtic mythology and hard rock rhythms, Irish folklore and urban rebellion, poetry and power chords. Songs like Whiskey in the Jar transform traditional ballads into statements of contemporary defiance, proving that Irish culture can be both preserved and revolutionized through the alchemy of electric instruments and authentic emotion. Phil's stage presence becomes legendary throughout Ireland and beyond. Where other rock singers rely on choreographed movements and practiced poses, Phil moves like someone channeling forces beyond conscious control. His bass playing is rhythmic and hypnotic, but his real instrument is his voice, a tenor that can whisper seduction or roar revolution depending on what the song demands. More importantly, Phil's performances demonstrate something revolutionary. That being different isn't something to overcome, but something to celebrate. When he takes the stage, his mixed-race heritage transforms from social liability into rock star mystique. The same darkness that made him an outsider in Dublin schools makes him magnetic under stage lights, exotic in the most appealing way possible. The breakthrough comes with "The Boys Are Back in Town" in 1976, a song that captures something essential about male friendship, loyalty, and the bittersweet nature of growing up in small places with big dreams. The song becomes an international hit, but more importantly, it establishes Phil Lynott as someone capable of writing about universal experiences while maintaining his distinctly Irish perspective. Success brings opportunities Phil never imagined. Tours across Europe and America, recording contracts with major labels, the chance to prove that Irish rock can compete with anything coming from London or Los Angeles. But success also brings pressures that begin testing Phil's carefully constructed armor against the world's judgments and expectations. The music industry of the 1970s is not designed for someone like Phil Lynott. Record executives struggle to categorize a mixed-race Irish poet who writes hard rock songs about Celtic warriors and Dublin street life. Marketing departments can't decide whether to emphasize his exoticism or downplay his differences. Radio programmers love his songs but worry about how audiences will react to his appearance. Phil's response to these challenges reveals both his strength and his vulnerability. Professionally, he becomes even more determined to prove that Thin Lizzy deserves recognition based purely on musical merit. He drives the band toward greater complexity and sophistication, writing songs that demonstrate his growing mastery of both poetic language and rock dynamics. Personally, however, the pressure begins creating cracks in Phil's carefully maintained confidence. The same sensitivity that makes him a gifted songwriter also makes him acutely aware of every slight, every moment of hesitation from industry professionals who can't quite figure out how to handle his success. He begins using alcohol and other substances not just for recreation but for medication, trying to numb the pain of never quite belonging anywhere completely. The late 1970s see Thin Lizzy achieving international recognition while Phil wrestles with the cost of success. The boy who learned to sing his way into acceptance is discovering that even worldwide fame can't answer the fundamental questions about identity and belonging that have haunted him since childhood. The stage remains the only place he feels truly comfortable, but increasingly what happens between performances becomes a source of anxiety rather than rest. Livin' Dangerous captures Thin Lizzy at their absolute peak, a double album that crystallizes everything Phil Lynott learned about transforming Irish outsider status into international rock credibility. The recording showcases not just a band at the height of their powers, but Phil's evolution into one of rock's most compelling frontmen, someone whose presence could transform any venue into a cathedral of rebellion and belonging. The album's success establishes Phil as more than just a successful musician. He becomes a cultural ambassador for a new kind of Irishness, one that embraces rather than apologizes for complexity and contradiction. His lyrics weave together Celtic mythology and urban realism, traditional Irish themes and contemporary rock attitudes, creating a synthesis that influences an entire generation of Irish artists who follow in his wake. But success at this level brings pressures that begin testing every survival strategy Phil developed during his outsider childhood. The international music business demands constant touring, endless promotion, and the kind of personal availability that leaves little space for the solitude and reflection that nurtured his songwriting. Phil finds himself living increasingly in the moment between stepping onto stages and stepping off them, with everything else becoming a kind of limbo that he struggles to navigate. The formation of Phil's personal relationships during this period reflects his ongoing struggle with intimacy and trust. His marriage to Caroline Crowther in 1980 represents his attempt to create stability and normalcy in a life that has become defined by constant movement and performance. But the demands of maintaining Thin Lizzy's momentum leave little energy for the kind of attention that marriages require, especially when one partner's job involves being worshipped by strangers every night. Phil's children, Kathleen and Sarah, become the source of his deepest joy and his greatest anxiety. He desperately wants to be the kind of father he never had, to provide the unconditional love and acceptance that his own childhood lacked. But touring schedules and recording commitments mean that he experiences fatherhood in fragments, stolen moments between the demands of a career that requires his constant attention. The pressure begins manifesting in Phil's increasing reliance on substances that promise to ease the transition between public performance and private reality. What begins as social drinking and recreational drug use gradually evolves into something more systematic and necessary, a way of managing the anxiety that comes from never quite feeling at home anywhere, even in his own success. His songwriting during this period becomes more introspective and complex, reflecting his growing awareness that external achievement cannot resolve internal conflicts. Songs like Sarah and Thunder and Lightning reveal an artist wrestling with questions about legacy, responsibility, and the price of living a life in which personal authenticity must be constantly performed for public consumption. The early 1980s bring changes to Thin Lizzy's lineup that mirror the changes occurring in Phil's personal life. Key members leave and are replaced, but the essence of the band, Phil's vision and voice, remains constant. He becomes increasingly the sole author of Thin Lizzy's identity, responsible not just for writing songs and singing lead vocals, but for maintaining the energy and vision that makes the band relevant. This responsibility, while flattering to Phil's ego, also becomes a burden that threatens to overwhelm him. The boy who learned to perform his way out of trouble is now trapped by his own success in a performance that never ends, where every public appearance must justify not just his individual worth but the worth of Irish rock, mixed-race musicians, and outsiders who dare to claim center stage. Phil's drug use during this period shifts from recreational to medicinal to necessary, a progression that occurs gradually and without clear warning signs. The same sensitivity that made him a gifted artist, the armor he built from music and poetry, begins to crack under pressures he didn't anticipate. Heroin enters his life not as rebellion but as relief from the weight of carrying so much expectation, so much representation, so much of Ireland's hopes on his shoulders. The black rose, blooming too brilliantly under stage lights, begins to wither in the harsh reality of daily life where armor can become prison. The tragedy is that Phil's increasing dependence on heroin occurs precisely when his artistic powers are reaching their peak. His later songs demonstrate a lyrical sophistication and emotional depth that rivals the best work of his contemporaries, but they're created under conditions that make sustainable creativity impossible. The release of Thunder and Lightning marks both Thin Lizzy's creative peak and the beginning of their end. Phil Lynott's songwriting on the album reveals an artist operating at the highest levels of his craft, combining Celtic mysticism with hard rock power in ways that create something entirely new in popular music. But behind the musical triumph lies a personal catastrophe that is beginning to affect every aspect of Phil's life. The songs on Thunder and Lightning read like prophecies written by someone who understands his own destruction but feels powerless to prevent it. Cold Sweat and The Sun Goes Down capture the paranoia and isolation that accompany serious drug addiction, while The Holy War transforms Phil's internal battles into epic narratives about good and evil, salvation and damnation. Phil's performance of these songs during Thin Lizzy's final tour reveals an artist pushing himself beyond sustainable limits. His stage presence remains magnetic, but those close to him notice changes. Erratic behavior, dramatic weight loss, moments of confusion that suggest his drug use has progressed beyond recreational into genuinely dangerous territory. The decision to dissolve Thin Lizzy after the tour represents Phil's recognition that the band has become incompatible with his survival. The very thing that made him famous, his ability to channel personal pain into public performance, has become the thing that's killing him. But rather than seeking help for his addiction, Phil interprets the band's end as freedom to pursue his drug use without the constraints of professional responsibility. His solo career, launched with Solo in Soho in 1980 and continued through the mid-1980s, reveals both Phil's artistic ambitions and his growing inability to realize them consistently. Songs like King's Call demonstrate his continued ability to create powerful, moving music, but the albums lack the focus and energy that characterized Thin Lizzy's best work. Phil's personal relationships during this period reflect the isolating effects of serious addiction. Friends who try to intervene find themselves cut off from someone who has learned to treat concern as criticism and help as judgment. Family members watch helplessly as the man they love disappears behind layers of defensive rationalization and pharmaceutical numbness. The Dublin music community, which once celebrated Phil as their greatest success story, begins struggling with how to respond to his obvious decline. Some enable his drug use through misguided loyalty, while others distance themselves to avoid being associated with his increasingly erratic behavior. Phil finds himself caught between people who care about him but don't know how to help, and people who provide what he thinks he needs, but don't actually care about his welfare. His poetry during this period becomes more abstract and fragmented, reflecting a mind that is losing its ability to organize experience into coherent narratives. The same sensitivity that made him a gifted songwriter now makes every disappointment, every moment of rejection or criticism, feel like evidence that the world was right to treat him as an outsider. Phil's final performances reveal an artist wrestling with the gap between his artistic vision and his physical capacity to realize it. He still possesses the voice and the presence that made him famous, but they now exist in a body that can no longer be relied upon to deliver what his imagination demands. By 1985, Phil's heroin addiction has progressed to the point where daily life becomes organized around obtaining and using drugs rather than creating music or maintaining relationships. The man who once transformed being an outsider into art has become genuinely isolated, cut off from most of the people and activities that once gave his life meaning and purpose. His final recordings capture an artist who understands what he's losing, but feels powerless to change course. The songs reveal someone desperate to communicate something important about love, loss, and the price of never belonging anywhere completely. But they're created under conditions that make clear communication nearly impossible. Christmas 1985. Phil Lynott collapses at his mother's home in Dublin, his body finally succumbing to years of heroin abuse that has weakened his immune system and damaged vital organs beyond repair. The Christmas holiday, traditionally a time of family gathering and celebration, becomes instead a vigil as those who love Phil watch him fight a battle that addiction has already won. The hospitalization marks the end of any pretense that Phil's drug use is recreational or manageable. Medical professionals quickly recognize the severity of his condition. Septicemia, pneumonia, and organ failure that reflect years of systematic self-destruction. The boy who learned to survive through charm and performance is now beyond the reach of either, dependent on machines and medications that offer life support but not hope. Phil's final weeks reveal both the devastating effects of addiction and the enduring power of love to transcend even the most destructive behaviors. Family members and close friends maintain bedside vigils, reading to him from his favorite poets, playing recordings of his songs, sharing memories of the man he was before drugs transformed him into someone they struggled to recognize. The irony of Phil's situation is not lost on those who knew him best. The man who spent his entire life feeling like an outsider is now surrounded by people desperate to make him feel loved and accepted. But addiction has created a barrier that love cannot cross, a wall of physical and psychological damage that no amount of care can repair. During his lucid moments, Phil demonstrates the same intelligence and sensitivity that made him a gifted artist. He expresses gratitude for the support he's receiving, regret for the pain he's caused others, and a kind of resigned acceptance that his story is approaching its end. But these moments of clarity only emphasize how much has been lost to the disease that has consumed his life. His death on January 4, 1986, sends shockwaves through Ireland and the international music community. Radio stations play Thin Lizzy songs in tribute. Newspapers publish obituaries that struggle to capture the complexity of his life and legacy, and fans gather outside venues where he performed to share memories and grief. The funeral becomes a public event that reveals the depth of Phil's impact on Irish culture. Musicians, politicians, and ordinary citizens attend to pay respects to someone who transformed being different into being special, who proved that Irish artists could compete on international stages without sacrificing their essential identity. But even in death, Phil remains something of an outsider. While his musical achievements are celebrated, his addiction is discussed in whispers, as if acknowledging the disease that killed him might somehow diminish his artistic legacy. This reluctance to address addiction honestly reflects broader social attitudes that treat substance abuse as moral failure rather than medical condition. The establishment of the Phil Lynott statue on Dublin's Harry Street represents Ireland's attempt to claim and celebrate its lost son. The bronze figure captures Phil in performance, bass guitar in hand, forever frozen in the moment when he felt most alive and most himself. But the statue also raises questions about how society commemorates artists whose lives ended tragically. Do we honor their art while ignoring their suffering, or can we find ways to acknowledge both their creativity and their pain? Phil's children, Kathleen and Sarah, inherit not just their father's musical talent, but also the complex legacy of loving someone whose addiction made normal family relationships impossible. They must learn to separate the man who loved them from the disease that prevented him from consistently demonstrating that love, to celebrate their heritage while protecting themselves from repeating his mistakes. The questions that Phil wrestled with throughout his life, about belonging, identity, and the price of being different, remain relevant decades after his death. His music continues finding new audiences who recognize something in his voice that speaks to their own experiences of feeling like outsiders, while his poetry is studied by scholars who appreciate his contribution to Irish literature as well as popular music. More than 3 decades after Phil Lynott's death, his influence on Irish music and culture continues expanding in ways that would have surprised and pleased him. The boy who struggled to find acceptance in 1950s? Dublin has become a symbol of Ireland's capacity for cultural innovation and international achievement, proof that being different can become being extraordinary when supported by talent, determination, and just enough acceptance to survive. The statue on Harry Street stands as Dublin's acknowledgement that Phil Lynott belongs in the pantheon of Irish cultural heroes, alongside writers like Joyce and Yeats, who also transformed personal alienation into universal art. But the bronze figure also serves as a reminder of the price that such transformation can exact, and the importance of recognizing addiction as a disease that requires treatment rather than judgment. Phil's music continues to influence new generations of Irish artists who see in his example permission to be themselves rather than what others expect them to be. Bands like U2, the Pogues, and countless others acknowledge their debt to the mixed-race Dublin rocker who proved that Irish music could be both authentically local and genuinely international. His poetry, collected and published after his death, reveals the literary sophistication that always existed beneath his rock star persona. Lines like, "I am just a cowboy, lonesome on the trail," capture both his sense of eternal outsider status and his understanding that loneliness can be transformed into art that speaks to others' experiences of isolation and yearning. The documentary films and biographical books about Phil's life struggle with the challenge of presenting addiction honestly without glamorizing self-destruction. His story offers important lessons about the relationship between creativity and mental health, the dangers of using substances to manage emotional pain, and the importance of seeking help before problems become insurmountable. Educational programs in Irish schools now include discussions of Phil's contributions to national culture alongside frank conversations about addiction and its consequences. These programs attempt to honor his artistic legacy while using his tragic death as a teaching tool for young people who might face similar challenges with substances and mental health. Phil's influence extends beyond music into broader conversations about identity, racism, and belonging in contemporary Ireland. His experience as a mixed-race person in a predominantly white society anticipated challenges that Ireland continues grappling with as it becomes more diverse and multicultural. The annual Phil Lynott Festival in Dublin celebrates not just his music but his role in expanding definitions of what it means to be Irish. The event brings together musicians, poets, and fans who see in Phil's example a model for how difference can become strength rather than weakness, how outsider status can become a source of creative power rather than social limitation. Research into addiction treatment often references Phil's case as an example of how creative individuals may face unique challenges in seeking help. The same sensitivity that makes someone a gifted artist can make them particularly vulnerable to substances that promise to numb emotional pain, while the lifestyle demands of professional music careers can make recovery particularly difficult. His guitars, now displayed in museums and private collections, are studied by musicologists interested in his innovative bass-playing techniques and his integration of Celtic musical elements into hard rock arrangements. These instruments, worn smooth by years of passionate performance, serve as physical reminders of the joy Phil found in creating music. The continued popularity of Thin Lizzy's music on streaming platforms and classic rock radio demonstrates that Phil's songs have achieved the immortality that eluded him personally. New listeners discover The Boys Are Back in Town and Whiskey in the Jar without necessarily knowing the tragic circumstances of their creator's death, proving that great art can transcend the circumstances of its creation. Music therapy programs sometimes use Phil's songs in sessions with individuals struggling with addiction, recognizing that his honest portrayal of internal conflict and pain can help others feel less alone in their own battles. His music becomes a form of connection between the artist who couldn't save himself and listeners who might still have time to choose different paths. The debates that continue surrounding Phil's legacy, was he a victim of social prejudice and industry pressures, or someone whose personal choices led to tragic consequences, reflect broader societal struggles to understand addiction as a complex disease rather than simple moral failure. His story offers no easy answers but provides a compelling case study in how talent, trauma, and addiction can intersect in devastating ways. Phil Lynott's grave in St. Fintan's Cemetery draws visitors from around the world who leave guitar picks, handwritten lyrics, and flowers as tributes to someone whose music continues providing soundtrack for their own journeys through alienation toward acceptance. The simple headstone bears his name and dates, but the true memorial to his life exists in the countless musicians he inspired and the fans who still find comfort in his songs. The ultimate tragedy of Phil Lynott's story is not that he died young, but that he died before fully understanding how much he was loved and accepted by those who mattered most. The outsider who spent his life seeking belonging had already found it, but addiction prevented him from recognizing and accepting the love that surrounded him. His final gift to those who loved him may be the hard-earned wisdom that creative talent, no matter how extraordinary, cannot protect someone from addiction's destructive power. But his life also demonstrates that even the most troubled individuals can create beauty that outlasts their pain, art that transforms personal suffering into universal comfort. The black rose of Ireland withered too soon, but the seeds he planted continue blooming in the work of every artist who chooses honesty over safety, authenticity over acceptance, and creative truth over commercial compromise. Phil Lynott proved that being different could become being magnificent, even if the price of that transformation was higher than anyone should have to pay. In Dublin, the statue stands watch over the street where music lives, a bronze guardian reminding passers-by that rock and roll can be poetry, that outsiders can become icons, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come from those who struggle most deeply with the basic human need to belong. The cowboy is no longer lonesome on the trail. He has become the trail itself, a path that others can follow toward their own forms of musical salvation and cultural revolution. The boy who learned to sing his way into acceptance became the man whose songs continue welcoming others into the community of those who refuse to accept the limitations that society places on their dreams. That may be Phil Lynott's greatest achievement. Not just the music he created, but the permission he gave others to create their own versions of beautiful rebellion.